In this episode, I'm joined by Douglas Cook, Director of Advocacy at the GlenDronach Distillery. Douglas, wonderful to see you. I'm very excited to be talking about GlenDronach with you today. For those of our viewers who aren't familiar with this particular distillery, it's one that I'm a big fan of, robust spirit, lots of sherry casks in there, but for those of them that don't know that, can you tell me a bit about the heritage and history of the GlenDronach Distillery?
Certainly, yes. Well, Christopher, delighted to be able to join you today. I'm actually joining you from Glen House, which is where it all really started at GlenDronach. This house dates from 1771, which predates the distillery, which was built back in 1826. It's located right in the heart of Aberdeenshire, in East Highland Hills, in what we know as the Valley of Forgue. So it's not far from Huntly, a good 10 minutes from Huntly, but it's a very historical distillery with a long heritage, going back to, as I said, 1826, with a real focus on producing pretty much one style of single malt Scotch whisky, and you alluded to that just there. It's rich, it's robust, and above all, it's richly sherried.
Well, I'm certainly a big fan and have been for a long time. I was hooked, probably 10 or 12 years ago on the old 15-year-old expression as it was then, and obviously there was quite a lot of excitement relatively recently when that expression was resurrected again and is better than ever. So what I'd really like to drill down into with you is this robust, heavily sherried style that the distillery is famous for. Where does that begin? How does that robust spirit come about?
Well, I mean, it's a combination of factors, really. So, for me, there's really one key facet which contributes to that, and that is the shape of the pot stills. However, before we get to that, let me just give you a little bit of background into how we make GlenDronach, because as I said, it's a combination. So first and foremost, we're in the East Highland region, so we have our spring water from the Balnoon Hills, which is just behind me here at the distillery. The spring water, which is relatively soft compared with some of the other distilleries in this area. For example, one of our other distilleries is very high minerality, but here it's a bit softer. And that water is mashed in a very traditional vintage mash tun. Our mash tun, cast iron mash tun with a copper dome. That's after we've used our 95-year-old malt mill. So it's a very, very old mill. So a lot of that old vintage machinery contributes to at least the creation of the wash. We have long fermentation at GlenDronach, so we get quite a creamy wash before we move on to distill it in what we call our saxophone-shaped pot stills. So at GlenDronach, we have what you could describe as relatively typical shaped Highland stills with a boil ball, and we have a sharp descending line arm, but the swan neck is beautifully curved, very much like a tenor saxophone. So it's really during the distillation process that we start to capture those like top notes and the base notes for which GlenDronach is known, and that oiliness, that viscosity running off the still after the 4 shots of approximately 20 minutes. That's where it really captures that robust character that you mentioned.
So how would you describe the spirit itself? Obviously, I've described it as robust, and it certainly is. But is it? Would you call it a sort of a fruity spirit, a waxy one, grassy, oily? How would you characterise the new make spirit from GlenDronach?
Well, I would describe the new make from GlenDronach is a little bit like, if you can imagine the kind of dark berries of wine gums. Dark wine gums or kind of red wine gums, that character's coming through. You definitely get the notes of berries, and actually the name GlenDronach actually means Valley of the Brambles. So you definitely get a bit of that black currant and blackberry rather note coming through in some of the spirit. But interestingly, you do get a bit of a slightly kind of leathery tobacco note at new make, in the new make. So it's really only obviously when we go on to mature it in the sherry oak that it becomes a GlenDronach. But right at off the still, we do have what I would describe as an oily character with top notes of berries and oranges and base notes of leather, tobacco, and even a bit of chocolate in there.
And once you've got this wonderful spirit that's full of these red berry fruits and that leatheriness and that chocolate character too. I mean, that's before we've even got to the casks that you use. And the distillery is quite famous for its history of using very high quality sherry casks. Can you tell me, where did that begin? Is that, I know it's not something that was implemented recently. That's a legacy at the distillery. So to share a little bit about that with us.
Indeed. Well, I mean, in more recent history, and I'm going back to the 20th century, GlenDronach wasn't always bottled as a single malt. It appeared round about the 1970s as a single malt, and since then, a lot of the GlenDronach that has been bottled has had that more sherry forward, that robust character. But the use of sherry casks and what you could probably describe as almost old world casks would have gone back to the 1800s. So James Allardyce was the founder of the GlenDronach Distillery. He lived in this very house that I'm in today. So I'm sitting in his living room, and this is exactly the type of house that the society back then, back in the 1820s, 1830s, they would have enjoyed soirees, dinners, and of course at that point in time, there were wine casks being brought in from Europe, from Spain, from France, from Portugal, and we certainly believe that James Allardyce would have been using those types of casks to mature the spirit, bearing in mind that the society at that point in time would have enjoyed those imported wines. But going back, even just looking at some of the documentation that we have here at GlenDronach, we have documentation certainly going back to the early part of the 20th century. We've got a file which shows all the correspondence, the importation of sherry butts from Cadiz. So it has been a long standing tradition here at GlenDronach to use primarily Spanish sherry casks, not exclusively, but mostly sherry casks, and our records definitely go back to the early part of the 20th century, but most likely, I mean, we understand that it was in the mid 1800s that distillers really began to discover the benefits and the facets of using sherry casks in their maturation.
So in the past, the sherry casks that would have been used by the founders of the distillery would have been import casks or export casks, really. Yeah, so the casks that were used to ship sherry from Spain over to the UK. But today, that's not something that occurs. Shipping in cask ended in the sherry industry in the 1980s, and since then, whiskey distillers have had to go to cooperages in Jerez to buy made-to-order sherry casks. So what kind of characteristics are yourself and Rachel Barry and the team at GlenDronach looking for when you go to these cooperages in Jerez to purchase newly coopered casks?
Well, we partner with a bodega and have done so for to my knowledge, well over a decade. And we specifically look for Spanish oak casks these days. So that's part of the specification nowadays, is that it is Spanish oak, and you have just bodegas in Jerez are using European oak as well as American oak, and for the GlenDronach's rich kind of tannic style, the Spanish oak is ideal for what we're trying to create. But we specifically look for two types of cask: Spanish Oloroso sherry butts and Pedro Jimenez puncheons, and sometimes that comes in butts as well. But those are the two specific types that we look for. And at GlenDronach, actually, we have a large percentage of PX casks here, whereas generally in the Scotch whisky industry, Oloroso casks tend to be to be the most commonly used type of sherry cask. But so that's our specification for what we import to Scotland.
And what do you feel is the difference in the character that's imparted by between the PX casks and the Oloroso, ex-Oloroso sherry casks?
Well, I mean, you do get quite a difference in character depending on the length of maturation. I mean, generally the Oloroso casks tend to pull out those orangey notes which I mentioned in the new make spirit. You tend to get a bit of a drier, nuttier character imparted by the Oloroso casks. You also get those typical, kind of Christmas spices, or dessert spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and so candied peel. Whereas with the Pedro Jimenez casks, which I'm sure as you know is a much more viscous, syrupy and incredibly sweet sherry, it imparts notes which we describe a little bit more like mocha, roasted coffee beans, certainly demerara brown sugar, and you even sometimes get a bit of a licoricey note coming through in some expressions.
Sounds delicious. Well, I think in which case we should perhaps have a drink. You've made me want one. So I understand that you've got a glass of the GlenDronach 12 years old there. And what's the cask makeup of that particular expression?
So for the GlenDronach 12 years old, we're actually using a combination of Oloroso and PX casks. So it's not entirely matured in one type of cask. Rachel Barry, our master blender, obviously selects casks aged over 12 years, and she'll use, because it is natural in colour, she's obviously using, through all the sampling that she does, a combination to get the right colour, which can sometimes be the biggest challenge in creating a single malt that's natural colour from vatting or bottling to bottling. And the PX, as I mentioned, does add incredible sweetness to the GlenDronach. And the new make spirit from GlenDronach is actually a sweet, quite malty spirit. But compared with other distilleries that might be a little bit more estery, GlenDronach is much deeper, much darker in colour. So the combination of the Oloroso, as I said, gives you more of those slightly spicy, kind of ginger notes, lovely dried fruits, sultanas, raisins, and a bit of a creaminess to it. But the PX definitely delivers not just the lovely sweetness and some of that chocolatey note, but a lot of the colour as well.
That's great. So is it all natural colour across the GlenDronach range then?
Yes. So indeed, we over the years, I mean, the distillery changed hands back in 2008 and then again in 2016, and natural colour is one of the key features of the GlenDronach. So it's incredible how much it evolves over time. Around about 8 to 10 years old, you're already getting those kind of hints of copper, but get to the 12 years old, you're getting into a much more burnished, deeper copper note. By the time you get to the 15, 18, 21 year old expressions, it's kind of graduating from polished cherry wood into dark, deep, polished mahogany notes. So it is one of the features of the GlenDronach which I think captures the eyes of most whiskey drinkers, just this beautiful, seductive ruby hue to it.
So if somebody was to pick up a glass of the 12-year-old, what are you getting personally on the nose?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's a beautiful oily spirit, as I said. So, I mean, I'm astounded at just how creamy and viscous the GlenDronach is. But on the nose, it's really very soft at first on the nose. It's not a particularly spicy nose. It's sweet, honeyed, a bit like sun-dried raisins. You get a soft spice coming through, but certainly on the nose, it's lovely and sweet. And as I say, the sweetness coming from the PX and also the spirit. The Oloroso gives you a bit more of that nuttiness and the dried fruits, a bit like raisins, but those cinnamon, nutmeg notes coming through as well. But on the nose, it's generally quite soft and sweet.
So that nose, it sounds very, very alluring. And obviously we've talked about this characteristic oiliness that the spirit has. So how does that nose transfer to the palate?
Absolutely. Well, it's let's have a little taste of this whiskey first of all. While it's soft on the nose, definitely those spices. There's a real crescendo of spice on the palate. The GlenDronach covers, if you cover all your palate, you're picking up all that viscosity, that sweetness, the honey, but those spices really kind of come into the middle of the palate. So at first you get that lovely burst of sweetness, like the berries, the brambles for which GlenDronach is known, the Valley of the Brambles. But you get that lovely, slightly chocolatey character alongside the fruits. So it's a balance of the fruits coming through from the spirit and also the Oloroso casks, so orange notes, or those orange peel notes, or perhaps a little bit of ginger. But the tannins, so we're using European oak, giving us a lot more of the tannins, so it gives you a bit of a dryness on the palate too. So quite an interesting character, and I think that's why a lot of whiskey drinkers really fall in love with the GlenDronach, because you do get a bit of a kind of sweet and sour character coming through. It's dry yet sweet, fruity yet slightly leathery, and with tobacco notes. And at 12 years of age, it's what I would describe as the creamiest of the GlenDronach expressions. So GlenDronach evolves from being more like barley sugar and malty into the introduction of the sherry notes with the 12 years old, and obviously as it evolves it becomes a lot more intense as regards the dark fruits. But for me the 12 years old is my real kind of everyday drinking dram. It really came about back in the 1970s and the 80s, when there were different versions of the 12 years old. And today we continue that tradition of bottling the GlenDronach at 12 years old, but using the combination of the two types of casks.
Well, I completely agree with you. I mean, it's definitely one of my go-to whiskies, particularly when people want to know, oh, where should I start with, with slightly more robust sherried whiskies. I think you can't go wrong with jumping in with the GlenDronach 12 years old. But if you want to go beyond that particular expression, obviously there's a 15, there's an 18, there's a 21-year-old in the range too, and a few more sort of even more special ones than that. But something that the distillery is quite famous for is its single cask program too, which I understand that you're in charge of. It must be real hard work, a big responsibility. So tell me more about that.
Indeed, so it was back in 2009, so the distillery changed hands back in 2008. In 2009, the first collection of casks from the distillery were released. And very soon they became incredibly popular around the world. And over the years that I've been with the distillery, so that's now coming up 10 years, I've looked after the bottling of primarily customer exclusive and market exclusive casks, but over the last 4 or 5 years I've been more involved in the batch releases, so the collections which we release on an annual basis, and these casks come from a real cross section of vintages from the distillery. So some of the younger whiskies being aged around about 10 to 11 years old, going back to some of the expressions from the early 90s, so from 94 through to 1990. And actually we've recently released a rather famous 1989 bottling, the Kingsman edition. So 1989 is a very rare vintage these days, but we actually still have casks going back to the 1960s, so the late 1960s, 1968 being the oldest whisky. So in my day-to-day role, I am working on the whiskies that are usually aged from 1990 through to around about 2008, 2009.
Yeah, that Kingsman whiskey obviously got quite a lot of attention. It's the second Kingsman whiskey that's been released in partnership with the film and its producer and writer and director Matthew Vaughn. So, tell me a little bit more about that project. How did that come about, and what kind of whiskies were you looking to pick out for those two Kingsman editions?
Well, it's an interesting project that came about because the director of of Brown Forman, who owns our distillery, is a friend of Matthew Vaughan. And Matthew Vaughan's favourite single malt Scotch whisky happens to be the GlenDronach, and he was very keen to have this partnership whereby we created not just one but now two expressions in alongside the movies which came out several years ago now, 2017, and the next movie will be coming out in 2021. And Rachel Barry, our master blender, had the great job of selecting very unique spirits for each bottling. So the most recent one has been from 1989, where Rachel has selected several Oloroso sherry butts, and then she's vatted them together and finished them in Pedro Jimenez casks for that additional sweetness and depth of character. And the character of GlenDronach from that period really is got all those notes of Dunnage Warehouse, dark truffle, beautiful characteristics which you can only really get over time. So we've really gone into the stock from the late 80s and the early 90s for those expressions. And the most recent bottling is themed around wartime. And you may or may not be aware of the fact that we actually have here the oldest bottle of GlenDronach to our knowledge that exists, and it was donated to the distillery by the family of a soldier who went to war, First World War, with his friends, each of whom purchased a bottle of whisky with the intention of enjoying it on the return. But sadly, only one soldier returned, and his family then donated the bottle to the distillery. So that's the connection. That was also a 29 years old expression, and the latest bottling is a 29 years old expression.
That's wonderful, and a very fitting tribute to those gentlemen and their memory, and a fantastic collaboration with Matthew Vaughn for this latest Kingsman film, which we're all eagerly anticipating after it's been sadly pushed back a couple of times for its release date, like so many things in 2020. So for those of us that are wanting to delve a little deeper into GlenDronach, are we able to follow the brand on social media or jump onto the website?
Indeed, yes. So we have the usual social media sites, so Instagram, Facebook. So we have those updated regularly. Visit us on our website as well. Look out for what we're offering here at the distillery as well. We're constantly looking at how we evolve the GlenDronach experience here, and our visitor centre has recently been renovated. So it's very it's small but very classical in design, and we have some great new expressions and experiences to enjoy here, which you can find out. You can find all that information online. So yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to when we're able to really enjoy the distillery to the fullest, because currently obviously there are restrictions, but certainly the retail shop is open, and we one of the things that's very popular here at GlenDronach is the bottle your own casks, of which we now have two. So look out for that information online.
I didn't actually realise you had bottle your own at the distillery. So next time I'm driving up that way, I'll be dropping in for sure to get one of those. And are there other distillery exclusives that you can only pick up either directly from the website or just by visiting?
So they're the main ones at the moment. So the bottle your own. I mean, there are some expressions which are limited editions, which are maybe only available in, for example, Asia, maybe not in Europe, or vice versa, and they're usually available at the distilleries. So we're looking forward to launching the next batch or collection of casks around the world, and the distillery has a bar these days, and it will have one of every single bottling. So it'll be the only place in the world to have the full collection. So yeah, there's elements of GlenDronach which we have discovered in warehouses, in storerooms over the last few years, and we're very excited to be able to have them now to be enjoyed here at the visitor centre. So yeah, just keep your eye on the opening times. At the moment it's open Fridays to Sundays, but come next year hopefully we'll be able to open up again during the week.
So though the distillery is very, very famous for its sherry-cask expressions, I understand that there is also a port cask available as well at the moment.
That's correct. Yes, we have the portwood, the portwood finish, which is a wonderful addition to the GlenDronach range. And again, back to the styles of wines which would have been enjoyed here at Glen House: sherries, ports. So the port cask maturation at GlenDronach really does pull out those red berry notes, the brambles, for which GlenDronach is famous, and it just adds that different character. So you're getting more of that chocolatey note coming through, but perhaps less of the orange notes, and more of the red berry notes. So it's a wonderful addition to the range, and we actually use port cask as well as sherry cask, so PX and Oloroso, in the traditionally peated expression, which is a bottling which is more akin to the style of whisky that would have been produced in the Highlands in the 1800s. So a lightly peated style, but this beautiful combination of peated spirit with the PX Oloroso and port cask maturation, and we use a combination of ruby and tawny port casks.
That's really interesting. So usually the GlenDronach is a completely unpeated spirit, is that right?
Correct, yes. I mean, GlenDronach is unpeated. We purchase our barley with very, very light peating levels, so it's non-detectable really. But you have every so often expressions which have been created using some of the peated spirit that was produced over the last 10 years. So it's an opportunity to just discover GlenDronach with a slightly different character. It's not robust. It's definitely not. It's a light smoke rather than peaty, and it's more, as I say, it's more reminiscent of the style of whiskies that would have been produced in the Highlands of Scotland during the 1800s, the early part of the 20th century, before smokeless fuel was used. So Rachel has really dialed up that rich sherry and port cask maturation. She's dialed down the smoke, and it's just this very elegant GlenDronach with just that light hint of Highland smoke, and the peat comes from this part of Scotland, the very northeast of Scotland. But it's unusual for GlenDronach. Most of what GlenDronach bottles is unpeated spirit.
Personally, I'm a big fan of pairing whiskies with different things like cheese or chocolate, and I know that's something that yourself and a number of your colleagues at GlenDronach like to do too. So if somebody at home is looking to pair either with cheese or chocolate, what would you recommend for that they choose?
Well, I mean, first of all, you can really experiment, find what's right for you. I'd certainly do that, and over the years, I've tried different textures and strengths of cheese. So one which goes particularly well that I do recommend is, if you like a blue cheese or a Stilton, try that with a GlenDronach 18 years old Allardyce. Beautiful combination. That lovely intense dark cherry chocolate note paired with the blue cheese is just sublime. So yeah, that's one of my favourites. But I think earlier than before I started tasting GlenDronach, appreciating GlenDronach with cheese, definitely chocolate and dark chocolate. The combination is just superb. Really complements the spirit and the character that you find in the GlenDronach spirit, matured in sherry casks.
Well, I am now hungry as well as thirsty. So I think with that, I'm going to go and try and find some Stilton and some GlenDronach and get started. So it's been really, really wonderful speaking with you. I hope that we can have a dram together at the distillery sooner rather than later. But thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome, Christopher. I look forward to that. Yeah, let's hope it won't be too long before we can do that. So thank you very much. It was great to talk to you. Thank you. Take care.
Take care now.